The moment a needle touched vinyl and Reverend Lee began to play, anyone who knew soul could tell. That was Roberta Flack. Just like you could recognize Aretha Franklin from a single note, or Luther himself from the first phrase that left his throat. In one old interview, he spoke calmly about diets, Optifast, and cutting back on food. But beneath that measured tone was a man who had spent a lifetime swallowing more than just hunger. According to later accounts, before his death, Luther Vandross did something that stunned people who believed they already understood him. The man who sang about devotion and forgiveness, whose soft tenor could drop a stadium into silence, allegedly left behind a page that was never meant to be public. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a newly crafted song. It was said to be a list, 10 names. 10 people he believed had poisoned the spirit of the music he loved. As the story goes, that sheet of paper was found beside his hospital bed, resting near his oxygen mask and a framed photograph of his mother. One assistant later claimed Luther had whispered, "They all smiled in my face while cutting me open." Whether the words were exact or not, those who were close to him agreed on one thing. Beneath the velvet charm and perfect phrasing, there was a reservoir of hurt. For years, Luther had been the industry's quiet gentleman, adored, overworked, and in his eyes, used. But in those final days, something seemed to fracture. He no longer wanted the truth, or at least his version of it, to be buried with him. These 10 people were not just rivals or critics. In his mind, they were the ones who had twisted love into bitterness, made trust feel like a trap, and turned his life's work into a cautionary tale. Quincy Jones, the god who pulled the strings behind the curtain. Most stories about Luther Vandross begin in a soft register. The voice, the romance, the slow songs that felt like warm silk on a cold night. But the story of what he saw as his greatest betrayal doesn't start with a soaring note. It begins with a silence, a studio light flickering out in Los Angeles, August 1982, while one man's dream quietly shifted into someone else's empire. That year, Quincy Jones was said to be the center of the musical universe, the architect behind Thriller, a project that would reshape the definition of pop for the entire planet. Luther, still hovering in the margins of mainstream fame, had reportedly been invited to craft background arrangements and lay down reference vocals. For 3 humid nights inside Westlake Studio C, he stacked harmonies by ear, building vocal cathedrals so intricate that engineers supposedly stopped what they were doing just to listen. People who claimed to be there insisted the track didn't truly breathe until Luther's voice wrapped around it. Then, 2 days later, everything changed. According to those accounts, his name disappeared from the session logs. Reels with his takes were replaced by new versions. When Thriller arrived in stores that November, his fingerprints seemed to linger in the phrasing and tone, like a ghost in the mix, but the credits belonged to others. That quiet erasure became the wound Luther was believed never to fully shake. In the months that followed, Quincy's status grew untouchable. Awards stacked up, glossy magazine covers anointed him the mastermind of a new pop heaven. Yet behind those glowing headlines, Luther reportedly saw something harsher, a system that dressed exploitation as excellence. He watched younger musicians get drawn into Quincy's orbit, their hooks and melodies disappearing into projects where their names were either buried in fine print or missing altogether. To the outside world, it looked like collaboration. In Luther's mind, according to friends, it looked more like carefully packaged theft, disguised as mentorship and opportunity. By 1985, when Quincy produced We Are the World, the distance between the two men seemed carved in stone. Luther was there at the early rehearsal, standing in the back row among superstars, his voice swallowed by the crowd. Insiders later whispered that his arrangement ideas were turned down before any tape rolled. To him, it was the same script. His gifts were welcomed, his presence was optional. Meanwhile, Quincy's personal brand expanded far beyond the music itself. Tabloids chronicled his relationships, his ever-rotating circle of young protégés, and alleged that ghostwriters sometimes completed songs he barely had time to touch. To most people, he remained a once-in-a-generation genius. To Luther, he was starting to look more like a businessman who had discovered how to sell sacred feelings as product lines. In one interview, Quincy compared music production to playing chess with people's emotions. Those words drifted through the industry like a cold confession. For Luther, they reportedly felt like confirmation that behind every shimmering melody on Thriller was a negotiation, a transaction, and behind every warm smile on a studio couch might be a signature traded for a piece of someone's soul. So when Luther spoke privately, as some close to him later claimed, about the 10 musicians he could never forgive, Quincy's name surfaced first. Not, in his mind, out of jealousy, but because he believed Quincy Jones had committed the ultimate betrayal, turning faith into formula and transforming the language of love into a corporate strategy. Berry Gordy, the manipulator of Motown. Every soul singer who stepped to a microphone after the 1,960 seconds walked beneath Berry Gordy's shadow. To the world, he was the visionary who gave Black America a polished sound, the founder of Motown, the dream merchant of Detroit. But to Luther Vandross, he reportedly represented something else. The man who, in his eyes, traded a generation's voice for control. According to the story, their paths crossed only once, but the scar it left stretched across Luther's entire career. In May 1973, a 22-year-old Luther arrived at Motown's West Grand Boulevard office, a demo tape clutched in his hand. He had scraped together money for months to record it, a slow, aching ballad called This Close to Heaven. He waited 4 hours in the lobby under the gold record plaques of Marvin Gaye and the Supremes before an assistant finally called him in. Gordy himself never stepped through the door. Instead, the verdict came back through intermediaries. The voice was too mature, too heavy, too serious for the youth market. The tape was handed back with a cordial smile, and in that moment it seemed the dream had ended before it had ever really begun. Years later, Luther was said to have discovered that elements of his song, the chord sequence, even a line from the bridge, had resurfaced in a Motown release by another artist. Whether coincidence or not, he took it as humiliation. To him, it became proof that Gordy's empire didn't need Luther the man. It only needed what came out of his imagination. That rejection turned symbolic. Gordy came to represent, in Luther's private view, an entire machinery built on control, a system that dressed rebellion in matching suits and turned struggle into radio-friendly optimism. While the world marveled at Motown's flawless choreography and crossover shine, Luther focused on the price behind the polish. He read old reports about artists being told to straighten their hair, change their names, hide relationships, and rewrite their histories. Stories of pregnancies brushed under the rug, contract disputes squeezed into silence, musicians quietly pushed out once they demanded more. Every whispered scandal from Hitsville, U.S.A. fed Luther's belief that Gordy had not freed black artists. He had, in Luther's eyes, redesigned their chains. By 1979, when Motown moved its base to Los Angeles, Luther was finally becoming one of the most in-demand session singers in the business. Yet he still refused to answer Motown's calls. When a Motown executive offered him a deal in 1981, he reportedly turned it down immediately, telling a confidant that Gordy made soul music feel like it rolled off a factory line. Over time, cracks began to show in the empire. Lawsuits from veteran singers revealed contracts that stripped them of royalties. Stories about Gordy's personal relationships with protégés like Diana Ross made tabloid covers, complicating the image of the gentle, fatherly founder. To Luther, those headlines were not surprises. They were confirmation of a suspicion he had carried since that day in 1973, that Berry Gordy didn't truly love the music itself, he loved owning it. Whenever interviews drifted toward Motown, Luther's answers grew short, his tone guarded. He rarely called out Gordy by name, but his compositions seemed to carry a quiet echo of resentment love songs, built with the precision of someone who'd learned that purity doesn't survive untouched inside legal clauses. In his mind, Berry Gordy was more than a mogul. He was the designer of an illusion, the man who taught the world how to package a feeling, and then made sure the unvarnished truth never made it onto the record. Stevie Wonder, the saint who drifted away from the streets. Some betrayals cut deepest because they come from heroes. For Luther Vandross, that hero was Stevie Wonder. As a boy, he was said to have memorized every lyric from Songs in the Key of Life, studying not just the melodies, but the faith, the humanity, the raw honesty that seemed to live in Stevie's voice. To young Luther, Stevie proved that soul could still be holy, until the day that belief shattered. It was the spring of 1992. New York City was still alive with Sunday choir harmonies and late-night doo-wop on corners. Luther was preparing his Power of Love World Tour, a show designed to drag soul music back toward its church pew roots. He envisioned Stevie standing beside him on stage for a medley of old hymns, a bridge between two generations of spiritual sound. The invitation went out, handwritten notes attached to demo recordings. Weeks passed. No answer. Finally, the call came from management, not Stevie himself. According to those present, the response was brief. Stevie would not participate. The reason, they said, was simple. The show offered no real financial return. That single phrase sank into Luther like a stone. Friends claimed he never fully let it go. In the months that followed, Stevie Wonder appeared in all the places Luther quietly avoided. High-paying corporate events, political fundraisers, televised specials framed by soda logos and fashion sponsorships. The same man who once sang about struggle and truth now appeared, at least from Luther's vantage point, as the smiling ambassador of luxury. When a 1993 soft drink commercial aired featuring Stevie performing Superstition under flashing neon branding, Luther reportedly turned off the TV without saying a word and left the room. Disappointment curdled into something heavier. He remembered the speeches Stevie once gave about social justice, about staying rooted in the neighborhoods that raised him. Now, it seemed, layers of security and management had pulled him far above those streets. To the public, Stevie remained the untouchable optimist, blind, brilliant, benevolent. But Luther noticed the distance growing, the way faith seemed to be sharing space with endorsements and political alliances. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated about how tightly his business partners guarded access, how easily his name could be attached to causes or products in exchange for the right price. In 1994, a magazine profile famously referred to Stevie as the saint who made peace with capitalism. Luther reportedly clipped the article, wrote 3 words across the top: "He forgot us," and tucked it away. He and Stevie would never stand on the same stage again. Luther still sang Stevie's songs during rehearsals, but those who heard him said there was a different tone now, something closer to mourning than tribute. To audiences, Stevie Wonder remained a beacon of hope. To Luther Vandross, he had become a warning living proof that even the most spiritual voice could lose its way under the relentless applause of the world. And in that realization, Luther's faith in music as something pure, untouched by compromise, finally cracked. Kenneth Babyface Edmonds, the man who cloned soul. By the 1990 seconds, R&B had slipped into a new skin. The rough edges were sanded down, the rasp of pain, the raw choir harmonies, the trembling confessions of men who had lived their lyrics began to disappear. In their place came something smoother, safer, the soundtrack of candlelit dinners, luxury sedans, and upscale hotel lobbies. At the center of that transformation stood one figure, Kenneth Babyface Edmonds. To millions of fans, he was a genius, the golden hand behind 1,000 love songs. To Luther Vandross, he reportedly became something else entirely, the man who helped drain the bloodstream out of soul music. Their worlds collided in 1994 at Columbia Records' Manhattan offices. Luther had just turned in demos for his new album, slow-burning ballads built on live instruments, gospel cadences, and the emotional tension he'd carried from the church pews to the studio booth. The label, smelling the massive success of Babyface's chart-dominating ballads, wanted a different direction, softer, shinier, easier to program between pop hits on Top 40 radio. Executives floated what they considered a dream scenario, a Luther-Babyface collaboration. For the suits in the room, it was a no-brainer. For Luther, it felt like sacrilege. He had watched Babyface rise from guitarist in The Deal to the crowned architect of 90 Seconds Romance, writing hits for Whitney Houston, Boyz II Men, and Toni Braxton. The industry called it brilliance. Luther saw something colder, a formula. In his private view, every heartbreak sounded interchangeable, every chorus engineered to please, every note buffed until it gleamed like glass but never cut. When the formal request landed on the 12th of March 1994, Luther's refusal was immediate. People who claimed to be present said he stood up, walked out, and left his gold pen lying on the conference table. Underneath the professional disagreement lurked a deeper resentment. Babyface had become the voice of a new kind of love, untouched by struggle, pristine, perfect. To Luther, that was an insult to generations of soul singers who had bled on stage and left pieces of themselves on microphone grills. He was convinced Babyface didn't write about love so much as manufacture it, the way perfume companies bottle feelings and sell them back with a glossy label. As the decade unfolded, that resentment hardened. Babyface's songs soaked radio playlists, wedding receptions, and movie soundtracks. His empire stretched from R&B to Hollywood, from soundtracks to superstar careers. And then came the murmurs. Studio assistants allegedly whispered that Babyface rarely completed all of his own lyrics, instead hiring younger writers to inject the pain. A former collaborator claimed that some of his biggest hits had been ghost-written, traded quietly for percentages and confidentiality agreements. Around the same period, tabloids hinted at a private investment arrangement with record executives, supposedly funneling money from lucrative soundtrack deals. Nothing was proven in court, and the accusations faded into background noise. But for Luther, those rumors fit too neatly into the picture he already carried in his mind. The man he believed had cloned soul was now, in his eyes, cloning success itself. The breaking point arrived that summer at the Soul Train Music Awards. Babyface walked away with Songwriter of the Year for I'll Make Love to You, a track Luther reportedly dismissed in private as music for elevators with dimmed lights. Cameras caught Luther in the audience, clapping politely, his face unreadable as Babyface accepted the trophy under roaring applause. Backstage, the two men crossed paths. No words were exchanged, but witnesses remembered the look Luther gave him. It wasn't open fury or obvious jealousy. It was something colder, like a teacher recognizing that his lesson had been replaced by a convenient copy. To the public, Babyface remained the face of romance. Smooth, dependable, evergreen. To Luther Vandross, he symbolized the funeral of authenticity. A generation of producers who, in his view, had never truly lived heartbreak, but were selling it wholesale. Where Luther tried to build cathedrals of sound out of sorrow and prayer, he believed Babyface was building shopping malls for love songs. And when Luther looked in his direction, he didn't see a peer. He saw an era where soul was being embalmed while it was still alive, beautiful, profitable, and, to him, disturbingly hollow. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, the architects of plastic soul. Long before computers ruled the control room, R&B had a pulse you could feel with your hands. Drums bled into microphones, bass strings snapped against calloused fingers, and minor imperfections became the magic that stayed on tape. Then came Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, the duo who, for many, reinvented the genre and, for Luther Vandross, allegedly rewired its heart. To the industry, they were visionaries, the masterminds behind some of the biggest records of the late 80 seconds and early 90 seconds. To Luther, they gradually came to represent the engineers of a future where emotion could be quantized and feelings came pre-programmed. Their story, as Luther told it to those close to him, began in 1987 at Epic Records in Los Angeles. Luther had just finished his album, Give Me the Reason, a project tracked live with orchestras, horn sections, and analog warmth. The label, anxious to keep pace with MTV's sleek, synthetic sound, suggested a remix. Not just any remix, one handled by the hottest production team in America, Jam and Lewis, fresh from the blazing success of Janet Jackson's Control. They promised they could modernize Luther's sound, slide him neatly between Whitney Houston and Madonna on mainstream radio. Luther's answer, according to insiders, was calm but absolute. No, the tapes would remain untouched. To him, this was about more than artistic stubbornness. It was fear of what he believed they represented. He had already watched Jam and Lewis reshape soul into precision-cut pop, live brass replaced with drum machines, choirs substituted by synth pads, sweat swapped out for circuitry. Their projects were undeniable hits. But to Luther's ear, they were too immaculate, too polished, scrubbed of the flaws that made a song feel like a living thing. As their success ballooned from Janet's Rhythm Nation 1,814 inches, 1,989 to New Edition's Heartbreak, Luther could feel his own corner of the musical world shrinking. Artists who once praised gospel choirs and live bands were now chasing sequencers, programmed snares, and rigid digital grids. The more deeply he looked into their process, the more mistrust he reportedly felt. Industry gossip painted a picture of marathon studio sessions where Jam and Lewis would erase entire vocal takes, promising they could fix the soul in post. Musicians who pushed back later claimed their names mysteriously vanished from liner notes. When Control sold in the millions, a few early collaborators surfaced with quiet complaints, unpaid royalties, altered credits, and verbal promises that never materialized on paper. Then came a brief lawsuit in 1991 from a Minneapolis technician who alleged he had shaped early drafts of several Jam and Lewis tracks before being pushed aside. The case disappeared before it reached trial, swallowed by settlements or silence. But to Luther, it sounded like one more chapter in the same story. He began to refer to their style of R&B, at least in private, as the mirror with no reflection. 8. Even as arenas shook to their perfectly synchronized beats, Luther mourned what he believed had been lost. Their triumphs, in his eyes, were funeral bells for an era of real-time musicianship replaced by presets, grids, and computerized emotion. At awards shows, he watched them stride onto stages in tailored suits, thanking God and technology almost in the same breath. One camera shot in February 1990 at the Grammys caught Luther sitting in the front row as Jam and Lewis's names were announced. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, his hands still. Luther Vandross never cut a record with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. Some said that was his quiet act of resistance. In his view, they were the high priests of a new faith where music did not bleed, it calculated. He didn't see them as villains so much as symbols of loss. Proof that, in chasing perfection, soul music had started to forget how to feel. Kashif, the architect who scrubbed the soul out of R&B. Hatred, when it finally hardens, rarely begins with difference. It begins with humiliation, and for Luther Vandross, few people quietly humiliated his art more than Kashif, the producer who, in Luther's eyes, rebuilt black music into something so spotless it no longer seemed to breathe. Their silent conflict started long before either man spoke the other's name. In January 1983, inside Power Station Studio in New York, an A&R executive slipped a cassette into the console while Luther was finishing a take. Out of the monitors came razor-sharp synthetic drums, a bass line gliding with almost artificial smoothness, and a lead vocal so clinically clean it felt, to Luther, almost disinfected. "This is what the new generation wants," the executive said. "That old churchy stuff is fading." End quote. Churchy stuff, the very foundation of Luther's identity as a singer, dismissed in one breath. He didn't argue, but an engineer later recalled that the air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. By 1984, Kashif had been crowned by many in the business as the sound of the future. His sleek, synth-heavy productions dominated urban radio. Inside boardrooms, executives began comparing Luther, not by his artistic depth, but by market performance against Kashif's newer, cleaner style. Internal memos, according to some staffers, described Kashif as modern, young, and clean, implying Luther was too emotional, too gospel, too unapologetically black for the emerging marketplace. It felt less like a creative comparison and more like a coded insult disguised as strategy. Rumors deepened the wound. A backing vocalist told Luther that in July 1985, during a session at Sigma Sound, Kashif had heard her slip into a gospel-style run and allegedly told her not to do that because it sounded unprofessional. Unprofessional. Gospel melisma, the heartbeat of black church music reduced to a flaw. When she shared the story, she said Luther went quiet, staring at the studio floor as if someone had torn a page from his childhood. By 1986, Columbia Records was quietly pressuring Luther to embrace Kashif's slick urban contemporary template. On August 14, label staff played him an instrumental built entirely out of digital polish and suggested, with rehearsed politeness, that he try sounding less emotional. The most emotionally honest singer of his generation being asked to erase the very thing that defined him. Witnesses said he stood up before they could finish the pitch and walked out, leaving the chair still slowly spinning behind him. Behind Kashif's rise were darker stories. Some musicians claimed he replaced live bands with cheaper synthesizers, cut background singers to avoid paying fees, and gently pushed artists to lighten the blackness in their harmonies to make the records more palatable for crossover radio. Whether every detail was accurate or not became irrelevant to Luther. In his mind, he believed them. Kashif, to him, became a symbol, the smiling face of a trend that was bleaching the soul out of soul music. Then came the dinner that sealed it. In February 1988, at a private industry gathering in Los Angeles, a drunk executive reportedly raised a glass and joked, "If Luther doesn't adapt, we'll let Kashif him redo him." As if he were a broken appliance that needed upgrading, not an artist. Friends said Luther froze mid-sip, his jaw tightening in a way they had rarely seen. This was no longer competition, it was degradation. By May 1990, when Billboard declared that urban contemporary had replaced traditional soul as the dominant format, Luther tore the page from the magazine and shoved it into a drawer he never fully closed again. That clipping, people close to him said, became a sentence he could not unhear. Urban contemporary sounded to him like a polite way of saying the industry no longer needed men like Luther Vandross, as long as it had men like Kashif. Years later, near the end of his life, Luther watched an old 1984 Soul Train clip of Kashif performing amid neon lights and perfectly sequenced backing tracks. A friend remembered Luther whispering, "That's when they stopped wanting us human." To the outside world, Kashif was a pioneer. To executives, he was efficient and profitable. But to Luther, a man who had poured genuine hurt and hope into every sustained note, Kashif became the architect of a new era where black music sparkled on the surface but, in his eyes, no longer dared to truly feel. And that, more than success or style, was the betrayal he never managed to forgive. Fun 3. R. Kelly, the preacher of sin. By the mid-1990s, gospel and R&B seemed to have found a new kind of preacher. He sang about heaven and temptation in the same verse, wrapped sin in silk, and turned confession into choreography. To his followers, R. Kelly was the sound of redemption you could dance to. To Luther Vandross, he reportedly became something far more unsettling. Proof that holiness could be packaged, sold, and worn like a costume. According to those who were there, their paths crossed in 1996 at a Sony Music Summit in Chicago. R. Kelly was at a towering peak in his career, riding the success of 12 Play and R. Kelly, albums that blended devotion and desire so tightly that the line between them began to blur. Executives at the label pushed for what they saw as a dream collaboration, a powerful ballad for a film soundtrack. The working title, people recalled, was "I Believe I Can Fly." Axe. The Suits described it as inspirational, a modern hymn. Luther allegedly sat through a single playback, listened in silence, then stood up and walked out. To him, the melody felt too clean, the sentiment too rehearsed, like a sermon written with awards in mind rather than salvation. The offer dissolved quietly, but the bitterness took root and never truly faded. Over the next few years, Luther watched R. Kelly ascend as a self-styled R&B prophet, performing in churches one week and nightclubs the next. His lyrics mixed prayer with provocation, slipping scripture beside seduction, until morality itself felt like just another hook. The industry embraced it. Fans shouted that it was genius. Luther, according to friends, called it dangerous. Then came the moment that turned suspicion into something darker. In February 2002, Chicago authorities publicly confirmed they were reviewing a videotape allegedly showing R. Kelly engaged in acts that, if proven, could have destroyed most careers. News outlets blurred the footage, but the story spread across the globe. Lawsuits followed, and settlements were reported to have disappeared behind sealed agreements. While the world debated guilt, innocence, and due process, Luther kept silent in interviews. But people close to him claimed that month he removed every one of Kelly's CDs from his home studio and threw them out. For Luther, this became more than a scandal about one man. It felt like blasphemy. He saw, in R. Kelly, someone who used the language of faith as a marketing tool, writing what sounded like hymns for profit, while, according to accusations, living a life that stood in direct conflict with the messages. When The World's Greatest was chosen as a theme for the 2002 Winter Olympics, Luther reportedly told a colleague that the industry had crowned, in his view, a false prophet. The disillusionment widened from one artist to an entire era. R. Kelly became, for Luther, a symbol of a time when image outweighed integrity and redemption could be manufactured like a music video. Rumors multiplied. Stories of controlling behavior toward young singers, coercive contracts, whispered accounts of studio doors locked from the inside, and protégés who vanished from the spotlight. Many of these claims were, at the time, unresolved or untested in court. But the smoke alone was enough, in Luther's mind, to suffocate whatever trust he still had left in the business. By the time Luther's health started collapsing in 2003, R. Kelly's star still hung high in the public sky, protected by hits and distractions. That contrast reportedly haunted Luther. He had spent decades writing about love that was tender, flawed, and genuinely redemptive, while watching a new generation, in his eyes, turn lust into spectacle and faith into a logo. To the world, R. Kelly was still a visionary to many a bridge from choir loft to nightclub stage. But to Luther Vandross, he became something else entirely, a warning etched into the last chapter of Soul. Because once sin learns how to sing convincingly enough, even the holiest music can start to lose its meaning. Luther Campbell, 2 Live Crew, the desecrator of soul. The summer of 1990 was humid, loud, and sleepless. Hip-hop had found one of its most notorious frontmen in Luther Campbell, Uncle Luke, the unapologetic mind behind 2 Live Crew. Their album, As Nasty as They Wanna Be, had just been declared legally obscene by a Florida court, making Campbell the first musician in U.S. history to face criminal scrutiny over lyrics alone. To his supporters, he was a champion of the First Amendment, a martyr for free expression. To Luther Vandross, he reportedly looked like something else, a sign that music had finally stepped over a line and left its conscience behind. Campbell's empire thrived on provocation. His shows were described as barely controlled chaos dancers on stage, pushing every boundary imaginable, explicit chants booming through packed venues, and handheld cameras, capturing footage that would later surface in music videos and late-night specials. MTV avoided his content. Church groups called for boycotts. Community leaders denounced him. Every protest only seemed to drive his sales higher. The more outrage he sparked, the more his brand grew. In July 1990, Luther appeared on a television talk show. Producers, eager for ratings, decided to stage a collision. They seated Luther Vandross and Luther Campbell on the same couch, the velvet-voiced balladeer and the lightning rod of explicit hip-hop. To them, it was a perfect spectacle. The saint and the provocateur of black music in one frame. What unfolded became, according to those who worked on the show, instant tabloid fodder. As Luther spoke calmly about dignity, emotion, and the responsibility to protect the depth of soul music, Campbell cut in with laughter, reportedly calling his songs soft R&B for church ladies. The studio audience roared with approval. Luther sat still. His eyes drifted downward. He didn't fire back. He didn't have to. But behind that quiet posture, the moment carved itself into him. To Luther, Campbell wasn't just mocking his catalog. He was mocking decades of sacred history, the struggle, the gospel roots, the discipline of turning suffering into art instead of spectacle. Staring at the crowd cheering for the insult, Luther realized something horrifying. Shock had become more valuable than sincerity. Music was being stripped of its reverence in real time, and people were clapping. As the obscenity case dragged on through October 1990, more stories bubbled beneath the surface. Former dancers described in some reports being pressured into performances that blurred the line between show and exploitation. Studio insiders whispered that Campbell hosted late-night parties where footage later reappeared in his videos. None of it was fully tested in open court, and much of it stayed in the realm of rumor. But to Luther, those rumors made his discomfort feel justified. He refused to appear on any award show lineup that included 2 live crew, even if it meant sacrificing exposure. It became for him a line he would not cross. Campbell came to represent the collapse of boundaries, proof, in Luther's eyes, that freedom of expression could be twisted into a mask for moral decay. In interviews from that era, Luther chose his words carefully. He rarely named individuals, but his message was clear enough. When laughter replaces respect, he warned, what we're selling isn't just music anymore. It's something far more precious. Years later, when Luther Campbell rebranded himself as a local political figure in Miami, talking about community values and civic duty, Luther saw it, according to friends, as a cruel joke delivered by history. The same man once banned for indecency, now speaking about responsibility. To some, it looked like evolution. To Luther Vandross, it felt like proof that scandal had become a kind of currency, and as long as the market stayed hungry, the soul of black music would keep trading away pieces of itself. Prince, the genius who mocked the sacred. By the late 1980s, Prince was no longer simply a star. He was a moving myth, lace, light, and pure electricity blurred together. Every show felt like a sermon delivered in symbols, half revival, half fever dream. He played more instruments than most bands combined, wrote for legends, and lived as if rules about genre, gender, and even God were negotiable. To Luther Vandross, he was both miracle and threat, the artist he admired more than almost any other, and the one who most deeply unsettled him. Their paths crossed in February 1988 when the Recording Academy invited both men to perform at a Grammy tribute to soul music. Luther was asked to close the segment with a classic ballad. Prince was scheduled to open with a medley from Sign of the Times. On paper, it was a perfect pairing, tradition and revolution sharing the same stage. At the last minute, according to production staff, Prince refused the shared format. He allegedly told organizers that appearing alongside Luther would make the show too safe. Instead, he performed alone, barefoot under a storm of purple light, pushing the audience into near hysteria. When Luther finally stepped out to sing, the standing ovation had already burned itself out. The energy in the room had shifted. Fans later remembered his performance as flawless, but Luther, in private, reportedly described that night as a humiliation overshadowed not by superior talent, but by spectacle. They never worked together again. Prince embodied everything Luther could never allow himself to become. While Luther battled silently with his identity, held in place by church teachings and fear of judgment, Prince walked onto stages in heels and lace, treating desire as divine and blurring scripture with seduction. Songs like Controversy and I Would Die For You folded religious language into erotic imagery. Audiences called it liberation. Luther heard something that felt closer to sacrilege. In 1993, Prince pushed the rebellion further, abandoning his own name and replacing it with an unpronounceable symbol, a bold strike against his record label that Luther would never have dared to attempt. Around the same time, stories circulated about his secret vault of unreleased recordings, his strict control over protégés, and rumors of emotional manipulation masked as mentorship. Luther watched from afar, both fascinated and disturbed. According to those who knew him, he bought every Prince release, studied the production, and even borrowed certain textures for his own arrangements. Yet he also saw in Prince's refusal to be contained a message that scared him. Chaos could masquerade as freedom, and rebellion, if left unchecked, might devour the very believer who preached it. When Prince was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004, just months before Luther's passing, hospital staff recalled seeing Luther watching the televised ceremony. For a brief second, a faint smile crossed his face. Admiration, it seemed, still lived there. But beneath that smile, there was an old wound. The knowledge that Prince had publicly embraced truths Luther felt he could never safely live. To the world, Prince was a holy madman, a divine contradiction. To Luther Vandross, he became proof that genius could dance dangerously close to blasphemy, and that sometimes, between heaven and temptation, there is only the width of a spotlight. George Benson, the jazzman who betrayed the groove. In the late 1970s, Luther Vandross looked up to George Benson as one of his purest heroes, a guitarist who could make six strings sound like liquid silk and a singer whose timing walked a tightrope between jazz sophistication and soul. When Luther recorded his cover of This Masquerade in 1979, it was his way of bowing to that greatness. He studied every chord change Benson had played, determined not to copy, but to honor. The release slipped quietly into the world, but the echo it left in Luther's heart was anything but soft. About a year later, in a June 1980 Downbeat interview, Benson was asked about Luther's version of the song. According to the published quote, he said, "He sings beautifully, but he doesn't really understand jazz." Those words sliced through the studio world like broken glass. To Luther, it landed as a betrayal from a mentor, a public dismissal that branded him as an outsider to the very language he had helped keep alive. The sting was sharper because Benson himself was facing criticism at the time. Jazz purists accused him of chasing pop success with Give Me the Night and other crossover records, claiming he had traded intricacy for chart positions. At the same time, tabloids circulated stories about Benson's private life, whispers of extensive gambling in Las Vegas, alleged affairs with backing vocalists, and rumors of risky business ventures that reportedly drained parts of his fortune. None of this erased his talent, but it did reshape his image. For Luther, the irony was sour. The man who publicly suggested he didn't understand jazz was, in the eyes of some critics, drifting away from that very tradition. The admiration he once held solidified into resentment. He quietly removed This Masquerade from his live sets. Benson's name stopped appearing in his list of inspirations. In private, Luther jokingly but bitterly referred to him as the jazzman who betrayed the groove, the teacher who had forgotten the lesson he once embodied. Where Benson turned deeper toward polished crossover hits, Luther walked back toward ballads that felt like prayers set to string arrangements. One artist seemed to be selling perfection, the other was still searching for some elusive truth. Between them remained a wound that never fully closed, proof that respect, once injured, can curdle slowly into contempt. Lionel Richie, the seller of smiles. Some rivalries are loud and public, others move like a shadow. The tension between Luther Vandross and Lionel Richie belonged to the second category, quiet but razor sharp. On stage, they represented two drastically different visions of love. Luther's was aching, spiritual, unmistakably shaped by hardship. Lionel's was polished, catchy, and safe enough for any living room in suburbia. Their collision peaked in February 1985 at the Grammy Awards. Lionel's Can't Slow Down swept the night, taking Album of the Year. Luther's Busy Body had been praised by critics as deeper and more vocally daring, but it went home with nothing. As Lionel smiled under the bright stage lights, Luther clapped along. Cameras showed him applauding, but those who knew him said they could see it in his eyes, the hurt behind the poise. To Luther, Lionel Richie personified the dilution of soul. Once the creative nucleus of the Commodores, Richie had reinvented himself as a solo superstar with songs that drifted away from grit and closer to glossy universality. Hits like Hello, Stuck on You, and All Night Long owned radio, soundtracking weddings, office parties, and commercial breaks. But to Luther, they sounded like letters sent from a world where pain never left a mark. He reportedly told friends that Lionel's melodies never bled. As the years rolled on, the bitterness sharpened. In 1988, tabloids exploded with stories of Lionel's alleged affair with a younger dancer, leading to a chaotic, highly publicized divorce. Some former associates accused him of abandoning black audiences to pursue mainstream pop immortality. Critics started calling him the Disney version of soul, a man who turned complex emotions into family-safe anthems. Even his reputation for charity work, galas, benefit concerts, humanitarian songs, began to look in the harsh light of industry gossip, like another layer of brand management. Luther saw all of it and, according to those close to him, was unconvinced. He respected Lionel's discipline and work ethic, but distrusted the persona, the man who always seemed to smile through every storm, no matter what was raging underneath. In one later interview, when asked about Richie's music, Luther gave what was described as one of his shortest answers. He makes love songs for people who've never been hurt. It was blunt, but for him it was the dividing line, because maybe that was what separated them in the end. One man sang to decorate the feeling, the other sang to survive it. One offered comfort without scars, the other offered healing that stung. When the final chapter of Luther Vandross's life was written, the industry chose to remember his tenderness, the slow songs, the candlelight, the gentle smile. Few were willing to talk openly about the anger he carried beneath that velvet tone. The list of 10 names he was said to have left behind was not just a roll call of enemies. It read like a diagnosis of the world he had spent his life working inside. A world that took soul, dressed it in gold, and sold it back to believers at a markup. Every name on that rumored list tells a story of brilliance twisted by ego, of purity slowly corrupted by fame, of artists who, in Luther's eyes, forgot what music was supposed to heal. Maybe Luther was not only writing down the people he claimed to hate, maybe he was writing down the sins of an entire era, which leaves the final questions not for him, but for us. Was he right to feel such rage? Or was that fury just another mirror reflecting his own pain back at him? Can any artist remain untouched in a business built on illusion, compromise, and carefully crafted myths? And if Luther could hear today's charts, where soul is often just a plug-in preset instead of a heartbeat, what would he say about the state of the music he once treated as sacred? Now it turns to you, listening on the other side of the speaker. Who, in your eyes, truly betrayed the spirit of soul? And if these were Luther's last unspoken confessions, what do they say about the cost of loving music